sessions that we've done so far together. Why am I here today? What am I hoping to gain or learn today? How can I use what I learned today in my everyday work and interactions? What pieces of my identity do I identify with most strongly? And that last piece is going to be really important as we think about privilege and our proximity to privilege. And just a really quick reminder regarding expectations. When sharing, please speak from the I perspective, honor confidentiality. Their learning can leave the room, but the stories stay here. Allow others the space to process and make mistakes. And if comfortable, say ouch if and when necessary. And it's okay to disagree, but it's not okay to deny someone else's truth. Just reminding us really quickly of our Courageous Conversations protocol from Dr. Glenn Singleton, staying engaged, even if at times this becomes uncomfortable, sitting in that discomfort and maybe processing through why you're feeling it in this moment. Speak your individual truth and expect and accept non-closure. So I am about to lead you in an activity that was originally based on the work of Brenda J. Allen and Dr. Thomas E. Walker, and I've heavily adapted it specifically for our purposes here today. And actually, every time I do this activity, I change it a little bit. So on the next slide, I'm going to frame our work for approximately the next hour. We have a little bit under an hour together today. And usually when I lead this workshop, as I ask people to think about and record their privilege, I have them actually do it with beads. So little pony beads that children would use to make necklaces, bracelets, what have you, so that you can visibly see your collective privilege. But for our work today, I'm just going to ask you to either make tally marks or find some system of recording that is going to work for you. I will say, though, I do highly encourage you at some point to transfer those tally marks to something physical so that you have that visual reminder of privilege with you. I do this activity every time I present it. I do it again right before I present it. And at this point, I don't even know how many beaded privilege necklaces, but they're really helpful for me whenever I am in a challenging situation or conversation, that I can remember the places that I do have privilege and start using that as a way of enacting change. So you are about to explore your privilege around various identities. And this is not meant to make anyone feel guilty or ashamed around having or not having a particular privilege. It's really to help us all understand and explore that we all have some privilege in different areas. And it's important because of that to learn how to engage with those aspects of our identity. And again, it's really crucial to sit in the discomfort that may come from doing something like this. And as you process that discomfort, think about why you're feeling the feelings that you're feeling. So you're about to explore several different identities. Each identity is followed by a list of 8 to 10 statements. Each statement describes one possible area of privilege. For anything that you can give a basic yes answer to, give yourself a tally. Anything you can give a basic no to, don't give yourself a tally. I will say for some, it may be difficult to just give yourself a tally or not. There may be some that require deeper thinking. And what I want you to do with those is note that. Note that that particular statement is a little complicated for you. And start to think about why. Why isn't it a simple yes or no for that system or statement? Note that the identifiers that are listed here are not meant to be an exhaustive list. We have a finite amount of time together today, so this is really a sampling. But as we go through this, I do invite you to think about what systems of identity are not represented here today. And I also want you to think about, why are those the particular identities that stood out to you as missing? What is it about those identities that makes you feel like you would like to explore them in the context of this activity? And our goal today is to begin to reflect. So again, please stay engaged. Should also note that normally when I do this, this is a pretty silent activity. So I ask that unless there is something that you need help with, or my screen starts doing weird things and you can't see a slide, to please refrain from using the chat box until we get to the debrief, so that you can really focus on your personal journey. So we're going to begin with nationality privilege. So again, remember, as I read each statement, please either give yourself a tally if you can answer yes, or don't give yourself a tally if you answer no. And if you're someone for whom it is easier to do this activity just by looking at the slides, you are free to mute me. When I apply for jobs, my legal right to work in this country will probably not be questioned. So if that's true for you, give yourself a tally. If it's not, do nothing. People generally assume that I can communicate proficiently in English. I have never been told not to speak in my native language or languages during everyday interactions. People do not assume I am poor because of my nationality. The history of my country, or countries of origin, is an integrated part of the basic US education curriculum. People from my country, or countries of origin, are visible and positively represented in politics, business, and the media. If I wanted to, I could travel freely to almost any country. And I know that's a little bit loaded right now, considering we're in the midst of a global pandemic, but let's think pre-COVID. People where I live rarely ask me what country I'm from. People do not assume my religious or spiritual beliefs based on my country or countries of origin. So to add a little context there, thinking about the difference between someone looking at a white man and not making any assumptions around religious or spiritual beliefs, and someone looking at a Middle Eastern man and thinking that he must be Muslim because he's from the Middle East. So now we're going to shift into looking at racial privilege. I can look at mainstream media and find people of my race represented fairly and in a wide range of roles. So again, if that's generally true for you, give yourself a tally. I don't think any of these statements are necessarily always true for someone. Schools in my community teach about my race and heritage and present it in positive ways throughout the year. I can go shopping alone most of the time, pretty well assured that I will not be followed or watched closely by employees because of my race. As an avid shopper, I would love to have that be true for me, but unfortunately, it's often not. I can take a job with an employer who believes in affirmative action without people thinking I got my job only because of my race. As a diversity practitioner, that's a question I field a lot. When I use credit cards or checks for face-to-face transactions, I don't have to wonder whether someone will challenge me because of my race. And again, to add context there, what that statement is really saying is if I use credit cards or a check for a face-to-face interaction, no one will think that they're stolen because of my race. I can do well in challenging situations without being called a credit to my race. I am never asked to speak for all of the people of my racial group. I can consider many options without wondering whether a person of my race would be accepted or allowed. I can walk outside without fear of being harassed or attacked due to my race. No one blames an entire pandemic on my racial group. Thinking about the increase in violence in the AAPI community right now and sort of the national rhetoric around COVID response. So now we're going to move into thinking about class and socioeconomic privilege. I can be relatively sure that my social class will be an advantage when I seek medical or legal help. So thinking about access. I am reasonably sure that I or my family will not have to skip meals because we cannot afford to eat. For a lot of families at the very beginning of the pandemic, food insecurity was a big concern, particularly for families that depend on school lunches after schools were closed. I have a savings account with at least 6 months worth of expenses set aside in case of emergency. And if you're someone for whom that was immediately true, I want you to do some thinking about how far that goes. 1 year, year and a half, 2 years. I have taken a vacation outside of the country within the past 3 years. That should say, if I wanted to. I have never been homeless or evicted from my place of living. I have quality health insurance. I would hope that that is true for the group that we are in right now. I don't have to rely on public transportation to travel to work or school. I can afford my own vehicle. And again, that's about monetary privilege, not thinking about personal choice and preference. The presence of obvious drug use, prostitution, or violent crimes are not common in the neighborhood I live in. The COVID-19 pandemic has not significantly impacted my finances, and even if it has, I know that I will be able to rebound. Right now, there are so many people for whom COVID really did hit them in the wallet, and they don't know, or they can't see a way out or the light at the end of the tunnel. But then there are also people for whom, yes, they were impacted, but going back to looking at savings and other sorts of things, they may be able to be okay because they were able to build up that safety net. Give people a minute. Okay, so now we're going to move into religious privilege. I can assume that I will not have to go to work or school on my religious holidays. This one is always really interesting for me as I think about our country and the perceived separation of church and state, yet the national calendar is very constructed around Christian holidays. I can be sure to hear music on the radio and watch specials on television that celebrate the holidays of my religion. My religious views are reflected by the majority of government officials and political candidates. Again, looking at number 1. Food that honors my religious practices can easily be found in any restaurant or grocery store. And if that's not true for you, I want you to also think about how far do you have to travel to make that true. Places to worship or practice my religion are numerous in my community. Most people do not consider my religious practices to be weird. Implicit or explicit references to religion where I work or go to school conform to my religious beliefs. I do not need to worry about the negative consequences of disclosing my religious identity to others. I do not feel ostracized or stigmatized for not observing or practicing an organized religion. I do not face judgment for practicing my religion in the way that feels best to me. We're thinking about religious observance on a spectrum and some people being extremely devout and strict in their faith and observance, and others having pieces that they hold on to, and the connotations that come up around that. So now we're going to move into gender, and I want to clarify that we're really talking about gender identity and expression in this slide, not necessarily biological sex. If I have children and a successful career, few people will ask me how I balance my professional and private lives. I actually gave a training last week on why that is an inappropriate question to ask a candidate at a job interview. My elected representatives are mostly people of my gender. The more powerful the elected position, the more this is true. And here it's interesting to think about also the fields that we work in. As an educator, I'm in a field that is heavily dominated by people that identify as female. When I ask to see the person in charge, odds are I will face a person of my gender. The higher up in the organization the person is, the surer I can be. It's also true for me in my school, and actually many schools where the majority, as I just said, of employees are female or female identified, but often have male heads or principals. I can carry out my daily activities without fear of being harassed due to my gender identity or gender expression. I do not have to disclose my gender identity, and I don't have to actively teach people to understand and acknowledge my gender identity or gender expression. I do not have to fear being misgendered, either accidentally or on purpose. Moreover, I don't have to fear being shunned or refused a service because of my gender identity or gender expression. And this is coming up for a lot of trans people right now in terms of healthcare and access to healthcare. I never have to explain or justify my gender identity or gender expression to people I interact with. Another way of saying that is someone can look at me and immediately identify my gender. No one questions whether or not children are too young to learn about my gender identity. Facing this at my own school right now, trying to help people see people across the spectrum and move out of those boxes and binaries. In doing my job well, I do not have to worry about how my gender plays a role in how I am evaluated or perceived. Thinking about power plays and power dynamics around gender in the workplace. So now we're going to move into sexuality and orientation privilege. I can formalize my love relationship or relationships legally through marriage and receive the benefits that accompany marriage, regardless of where I live. You can also think about, has this always been true for you? I can move about in public without fear of being harassed or physically attacked because of my sexual orientation. I do not have to fear negative consequences if my family, friends, coworkers, students, parents find out about my sexual orientation. If I want to, I can easily find a religious community that will not exclude me because of my sexual orientation. No one questions the normalcy of my sexual orientation or believes that my orientation was caused by psychological trauma, sin, or abuse. As a queer identified person, I have heard all three. I do not have to think about the message my wardrobe sends about my sexual availability. I often make the point to people that a human can be naked walking in the street, does not invite assault. I can easily find sex ed literature for couples with my sexual orientation. One of the things that libraries have started doing is looking at sensitive topics and posting in various places around the library where you would find that sort of literature. And while that is great, I also want us to think about the fact that there's still a taboo around this literature specifically, and the fact that it's considered a sensitive subject and not just something people feel like they can ask about freely. I do not have to consult with specific networks to find a provider who will treat me with the respect and care I deserve because of my sexual orientation. So now we're going to move into my favorite category to talk about, ability privilege, mostly because ableism drives me insane. I can assume that I will easily have physical access to any building. One of the things that became very true during the height of the pandemic was when grocery stores required people to wait outside in lines to minimize the amount of people in the store, which made perfect sense. Many of those lines were formed in handicap parking spaces. Now, if you are someone for whom it is absolutely essential to have one of those spaces, think about someone who might be wheelchair bound and needs the van access space to be able to exit their vehicle. They've now been denied access. I have never been taunted, teased, or socially ostracized due to a disability. And you can think about that in terms of mental health challenges and the stigma that still exists around mental health. I can do well in challenging situations without being told what an inspiration I must be to people of my ability status. I'm an inspiration to myself on days where I'm having a good pain day and I can get out of bed easily. Does not mean that's inspiring to anyone else who shares my condition. I can go shopping alone and expect to find appropriate accommodations to make the experience hassle-free. Goes back to what I said in number 1. I can hear what's going on around me without an assistive device. I can easily see the letters on this page. I am reasonably certain that others do not think my intelligence is lacking just because of my physical status. I am fired, not given a raise, or not hired, I don't question if it has anything to do with my physical or mental ability. In general, I can wake up every morning and go about my day without worrying that my physical or mental status will be impeded. Will impede that, either mildly or significantly. So I am someone who has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and my day-to-day definitely depends on how much pain I wake up with in the morning and whether or not my joints have subluxed or dislocated during the evening. I often have to sit up and do a body check and make sure everything is in their socket where they're supposed to be before getting up and starting my day. So now we're going to shift and we're going to think about healthcare privilege and what that can look like for some. I have adequate medical insurance that will cover me or my family if I or we get sick. I do not fear that doctors will ignore or downplay my symptoms if I am sick. And here I want us to think back to what we talked about, microaggressions, and the belief that it's still held by some in the medical community that BIPOC people, and really specifically Black people, have a higher pain tolerance. If I am prescribed medication, I can afford it and trust the information that instructs me to take it exactly how it was prescribed to me. Lots of fear, especially in communities of color, around medication and a stigma that's associated with taking medication. I do not have to worry about a language barrier in seeking healthcare. And that would be both in terms of native or fluent languages and medical jargon. I feel like my doctor understands me and my community / life circumstances. Think about what it takes to build trust with someone. My doctor and healthcare teams look like me. I do not have to make a decision between paying for health care or prescribed medications and paying for other necessities. So again, going back to that notion of good or adequate medical insurance. Physically getting to medical appointments doesn't come at a huge personal sacrifice, whether that's monetarily or work-wise. As an educator, spent years not going to therapy because often therapists do not work after 4 o'clock when school ends. Thankfully, as an administrator, I have a much more flexible schedule, and telehealth appointments have been wonderful. So now I want us to think about positional privilege and really thinking about your place in your organization where you work and how this feels to you. I have final approval on decisions made within my organization or department. The main way in which I receive feedback is if I personally ask for it. No one imposes it on me. I directly report to 3 or less people, and very few have the power to hold me accountable for my actions. And to clarify there, really thinking about the amount of power you have in your position, the amount of freedom and flexibility and autonomy you have in your position. I am knowledgeable about or control the budget of my organization or department. I am knowledgeable about or control opportunities like promotions, nominations, awards, and avenues of advancement. If I underperform or make a mistake, I don't have to feel like I could be fired or receive other types of severe disciplinary action. Now, this is not to say that if someone is not suitable for their job, that they should not be spoken to, but thinking about smaller mistakes, thinking about things that naturally happen. We're all works in progress. I have confidence that if I want something done, others in my organization will carry out these wishes. So if I give my staff or my team a list of things to do, they will actually do them. I have mixed privilege there in my organization. Overall, I can interact with coworkers using my immediate reactive feeling or emotion without negative consequences. So thinking about tone policing and telling people how they're supposed to respond and the language that they're supposed to use and the tone of voice they're supposed to use. So we're about to move into the debrief. And before we do that, I want everyone to take a look at their tallies or however you organized your systems of privilege. I want you to look at the areas where you have the most tallies. I want you to look at the areas where you have the least tallies. And I want you to think about, is anything surprising there? Is there anything that comes up that's standing out to you? Something you would not have expected when I described the activity to you at the beginning. So what was it like to focus on your privilege as opposed to a marginalized identity? People can feel free to unmute.
Yes, I would say it's the things I just naturally take for granted that I don't even realize I'm taking for granted, like privilege of nationality.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else?
I would say that when you introduced it, I assumed that I was going to have a lot of tallies, but I didn't really know your categories. And so for a lot of the stuff that I thought you would do, I wasn't surprised that I have a lot of privilege. But the last one you did in terms of positional privilege, I hadn't thought of that at all. So that was more eye-opening to think of in a bigger organization where I am just like, even though I'm in a position of power in terms of my job as a physician in the whole organization, I'm pretty far down. And so it was just eye-opening to realize that lack of privilege in that situation.
Thank you for sharing that. And for that one specifically, it's really important to think about as we think about how we shift systems within our organizations.
I gotta say that as a Hispanic female, I was pleasantly surprised that I have actually a lot more tally marks than I thought I was going to. I often come to these things and I'm like, okay, great, I'm gonna leave feeling like crap. And then was actually like pretty happy about like, oh, there's quite a bit of stuff that like I don't have to worry about on a daily basis. Not to say that like I'm super excited about having privilege over others, but like I'm thankful that like I don't have a physical disability and am able to see and things like that. So it was eye-opening in that sense as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's actually one of the reasons why the number of categories are what they are. And it's why we focus on looking at the privilege there, especially for people who have multiple intersecting marginalized identities. So using myself as an example, speaking from the I perspective, as a Black, queer, disabled woman, I could look at many of these categories and go, yeah, my privilege tallies aren't really high, but then I look at things like socioeconomic status. And while I'm not necessarily upper class, I'm definitely comfortable with my salary and I don't have to make decisions around, can I afford medical care and my medications? Do I have to skip a meal tonight? So for myself, it's important to remember that balance and that it's a both and. And not that anyone necessarily has to answer this question right now, but was this a new experience for you? And if it wasn't, how did today's experience feel different? What did it bring up for you that was different than maybe a previous time when you did this? Like I said at the beginning, whenever I do this activity with folks, I always do it again right before to see if things have shifted and changed for me. And I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I've done things like this before, but I never observed them lumping them and making explicit what those categories were. And also just sort of the gradation of just this vast national privilege, which has shifted a little, as you said, we can't necessarily travel right now as easily because of COVID. But even literally thinking about that example, like it really appeared to me as a giant shock that someone could just say, no, you can't travel. And so I experienced your putting them together like that as a lot more, it was just more eye-opening to realize how many different kinds of things fall into each of these very large and somewhat under-identified privileges, categories.
Definitely true. And I'm curious, what sorts of emotions this brought up for folks? Anybody willing to share? Don't necessarily have to explain or justify the emotion, but just what this felt like.
Comforting.
Gratitude.
Others? Anyone else?
Well, it makes me think like, how can I make this better for people who don't have as much privilege, right? I think that's what I'm waiting for that. I know you're getting there.
And there's the magic question, right?
People who have less privilege that I'm interacting with.
And there's the magic question, right? There are oftentimes when I do this, people will say, well, I feel guilty that I have this privilege. And my response is often, okay, but guilt is a feeling. It's not an action. So what are you going to do about that guilt? Because if you just sit here in the guilt, who is that serving? Certainly not serving me. I highly doubt it's serving you. So what do we do about that? And yes, I'm definitely going to get into the what do we do. So we've actually already talked about this, why it's important for us to be aware of these aspects of our identities. And it's also important to think about why we don't have to think about them on a regular basis. Like I've heard people share that for them, the nationality privilege was something that they don't often think about. As someone who is a child of immigrants, it's something that I think about quite often. But that's not true for everyone. If you have multiple generations of your family who were born in this country, and it's not a bad thing, it's just in that identity for you, it's not something that you're consciously always aware of. And activities like this are so important for that reason, to remind us that we don't all have the same access to things. So this goes back to the sort of question that I asked when we started this slide. How proximate to privilege are you feeling in this moment? If you think about privilege as this wide spectrum, in general, where do you feel yourself landing? Do you feel yourself leaning more towards total privilege? More in the other direction? Or are you feeling somewhere in the middle because you've got lots of privilege in some areas and really minimal privilege in other areas? And there's no right answer. Having extreme privilege does not make you a bad human. And in some ways, actually makes you a great human if you can activate that privilege and use it to break down systems that don't work and that prohibit others from having those same privileges. Something else that I invite you to think about is beyond how you can connect to folks, and really think about, after going through this activity, what does this do for your interactions with other people? So moving beyond understanding that you may have a privilege that someone else doesn't, or vice versa, but how can you actually use what you learned here today in interactions? Does it help you to be more patient or generous with people or with yourself? I know that the very first time I did this, it was really eye-opening for me. And it helped me cultivate empathy for people who didn't necessarily understand their privilege. When the categories for me that came up where I have a lot of privilege showed up, it made me pause and go, oh, okay, I have tons of privilege here, and I never really considered that. Oh, that's why it's really hard for people to acknowledge their privilege, because we don't think about it often. So how does that help your interactions with people? And how does it help us to hold both ourselves and our colleagues accountable? So at the beginning, I mentioned that this wasn't an exhaustive list and that there were many other things that could be considered. And not that you have to share them right now if you don't want to, but if you would, please feel free to. I'm wondering what sorts of identities or identifiers came up for folks. What are the systems that you wish were included today? And why are you thinking about those? What is it about those that makes it important for you to think about them in this moment? And while we did examine race as an identifier, one thing that I want to specifically highlight, especially as we're thinking about anti-racist action and anti-bias action, is to really think about what it felt like over the past month for many people of color, and really specifically Black people, watching the Derek Chauvin trial. I think that it's true that for many people across the race spectrum, that this case was hard to digest. But I invite us to really think about what that might have felt like for people who shared the same racial identity as George Floyd. Consider whether you spent this time trying to shield your child or your children from coverage to preserve their dignity and humanity, to let them know that their life actually does matter in this country. Also consider whether or not you had a speech planned to explain to your child that, yet again, the justice system failed Black people in this country. As an educator, it killed me that I had to prepare this speech, but I've had to give it so many times. And thankfully, in this case, the verdict went opposite of what I expected. And while that's positive in some respects, doesn't necessarily change the overall system. And finally, I want you to consider this question and whether or not you've ever had to answer it. Will the police kill you or me too? I've had my students ask me this question. I've had parents call me and tell me their kids are asking them these questions. I had a parent email last week to say her child woke up in the middle of the night having a nightmare that this was happening. And I think about the mental health of children and the world that they're growing up in. I'd also be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the incredibly horrific treatment of AAPI people right now, Asian American Pacific Islanders, in this country over the past year, and really for decades, but really specifically over the past year, and the national rhetoric that's given a pass to this behavior. Maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, in my own community, I drove past an anti-China rally, not an anti-Asian, but specifically an anti-China rally, where people held up billboards on the top of their cars that said, "The People's Republic of China, the real cause of the virus." And I work in an elementary school, as I've shared, and students have shared very real circumstances in treatment that their families are facing right now. We had a 4th grader bring every single person in that room, teachers and students included, to tears because of his description of how his family has been treated because of their racial identity. We have to call out these acts of injustice and racism as what they are. Last week, we saw a very small glimmer of hope that we might finally be ready to have some real conversations around systemic oppression and xenophobia and white supremacy, both in terms of the Derek Chauvin trial verdict and some anti-hate legislation that's been passed. And those are small steps, but they're steps. And I invite us to think about the areas that we have the most privilege in, and to start thinking about, how can I elevate that? How can I use the privilege I have in these areas to start acting? What can I do with that? And I also want you to really examine the areas where you don't have privilege, and think about the people that you know that do have privilege in those areas. Collective privilege is a really powerful thing. And when we work together, that's how we move this work forward. So it's important not only to know ourselves and our proximity to privilege, but also to think about the other members of our communities and our teams and our departments, so that we can collectively leverage that privilege. And honestly, we owe it to the next generation to not leave all of this to them. As one of my students said to me a few weeks ago, "Miss Anselm, my generation didn't cause these problems. It's unfair to expect us to fix all of them." That's like only asking Black people to fix racism when they didn't invent it. It's not right. The student in particular leaves me dumbfounded many, many times with the insights that he shares. So, some final questions to reflect on. And then for your debriefs that are coming up afterwards, I have some discussion questions on the last slide that Beth will lead you through. So what more might you have to do to activate your privilege? Can you immediately identify barriers that may make this more difficult? As you think about our work over the last almost hour, what is one immediate action step you can take to promote change in your work? And why is that where you decided to start? Once I get to the end here, I invite you to take a picture of this slide so you can continue to reflect on these questions. Who are the people in your organization who can support this step? So again, thinking about those areas where you may not have privilege, but thinking about folks that you know who do. What may you have to give up or risk to take this action step? Always the question that people ask, what does this mean for me personally if I do this? How will this impact me? And if there are potential negative impacts, am I ready to deal with those? Can I deal with those? Am I in a position of power to be able to deal with those? What would it look like to turn your tallies into something wearable after this session, like I recommended. What would it mean for you to wear this noticeably for the rest of the week? What conversations might it spark if someone asked you why you're wearing a beaded necklace? How might it change your thinking and planning for this year in your department? Might it be a reminder of what can be done? When I'm feeling particularly stressed, I often get into spaces of I can't. And my privilege beads remind me, actually, there are some I cans in there. There may definitely be some I can'ts, but there are some I cans in there. So I will show you these discussion questions so that you can begin thinking about them for your debriefs. But
So
we're not going to
Jaleesa-
answer them.
Yeah, Jaleesa, I'm just going to say that we only have a minute or two more. We do have follow-up discussion sessions scheduled. If people do not have that list, please contact me or Christine so that you can sign up. We would love to have you participate. And this, I thank you for the discussion questions. I think that will really help guide us.
You're welcome. And that's actually all I have.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jaleesa, for joining us again. Really appreciate you guiding us through this work. And it's, each time we get a little further down the road.
So excited to be able to spend this time with you all. And thank you for letting me lead you on that journey for the last hour.
Oh, that was terrific. And we're excited to also have you back. So folks, please, of course you can reflect on your own. It's not required to be part of these debrief sessions, but if you want to be able to talk with other people and to go through some of the questions that Jaleesa just posed, please sign up. And we will continue these conversations as we move forward as a group. And then we have one more session with Jaleesa next month.
Well, thank you all for having me back, and I will see you all for that last session next month.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.